All right, at long last, we are finally graphing polynomials using all the stuff we've learned from the previous parts of this section. So our first step in graphing is we want to factor to find all the x-intercepts, or the roots or the zeros. So we do that here. Factor by grouping. If you get a foursome, you want to factor by grouping, same way you normally would. And then that gives us this. Now you always consider, is one of the things you factored further factorable, and this one is, so we factor that difference of squares. There's the factored form. So that tells us that we have roots at -2, 2, and 3. So those are going to be the x-intercepts. Now, to determine whether it's above or below the graph on either side of those points, we have to test some points, but I don't really care about the numbers I get. I'm just trying to figure out whether it's positive or negative and consider the end behavior. So the end behavior for a graph like this, it's an odd function with an a value that is positive with n odd. So it's going to be negative infinity to the left, infinity to the right. So we know that over here is going to be negative numbers. Over here is going to be positive above the x-axis. And then we have to test a couple points to see what's going on there. So let's test x equals 0. Now when I plug it in, I'm going to plug it into the factored form. And all I care about is the sign. So I plug in 0, I get a 2, that's a positive number. When I plug in 0 to the second part, I get a -2, that's a negative number here. So I just care about the sign of the result when I plug in the x. So I chose x equals 0 because it's really easy to do the mental arithmetic. I have a positive times a negative times a negative. That results in a positive. So that means that when x is 0, there is we're above the graph. And then because of the end behaviors, we know that we're positive and negative here. And then because of the number of turning points possible for this graph and the number of times it hits the x-axis, the graph has to cross like that. Now the y values are actually messed up. It's a lot steeper. We kind of ignore the y scale for now at this point in the game. So we're trying to just get the basic feel for the graph. All right, one more example. All right, so first I'm going to do this is factor completely. It's factored completely, but I want to point out that that's a double root there. All right, so when the x plus 2 squared really means there's an x plus 2 times an x plus 2 in there. That gives us this double root. That means it has a multiplicity of 2. So that tells us that the graph is going to bounce off the x-axis there. All right, so there's our zeros, -2, 1, and 2, 1 and 3. But our graph is either going to bounce off like this, or it's going to bounce off like that, depending on the rest of the situation. So we look at the end behavior because it's a positive coefficient and n is even. It's going to be positive infinity to the left and the right. So we know that our graph's going to be above there. I'm going to test a couple of points. Testing zero is really easy. So I plug that in, and that gives me positive squared times a negative, which is a positive result. So that's why that is positive there. I don't actually have to test -10 because of the end behavior. I know that it's positive over here too. All right, we already said that. And then I'm going to test a 2 to make sure, see where we are in this region here, whether we're above or below the graph. So that gives me, when I plug it into the original, 2 plus 2 is a positive number, squared is a positive number. And when I plug it into the other parentheses, it gives me a positive result and a negative result. Multiplying that all out, I get a negative result, so I know I'm below the graph here. All right, so knowing I'm above, bouncing, staying above, then below, then above, tells me my graph is going to have to look like this. When we put it all together, basically that is how the graph looks. All right, now your U-tries are going to be these problems here. All right, good luck. We'll see you next class.